The world first tore itself apart in a scream of tortured metal, a sound so violent it seemed to rip the sky open. 7-year-old Lily squeezed her eyes shut, her small hands clamping over her ears. She had been crouched low to the damp earth, her fingers carefully tracing the delicate, star-shaped petals of a ghost orchid, a secret treasure the forest only shared with those who were patient. One moment, there was only the gentle hum of the woods, the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of a squirrel, the soft sigh of the wind through the towering pines. The next, a monstrous shadow had blotted out the sun, and the air itself had begun to whine, a high-pitched, terrifying thrum that vibrated deep in her bones. She looked up, her blue eyes wide with a fear that stole her breath. A great metal bird, bigger and louder than any she had ever seen, was falling. It tumbled end over end, a broken toy tossed by an angry giant, trailing a thick plume of black smoke that stained the pristine blue canvas above. Then came the crash, a deafening explosion of sound and fury that sent a shockwave through the ground, knocking her from her crouch. Birds erupted from the treetops in a panicked cloud, and for a long moment an unnatural silence fell over the forest, as if the world was holding its breath. Trembling, Lily slowly lowered her hands. The acrid smell of burning oil and hot metal stung her nostrils. Through the dense latticework of branches, she could see a column of smoke rising, thick and ugly, not more than a half-mile away. Every instinct, every story her grandmother had ever told her about the dangers of the woods screamed at her to run, to flee back to the safety of their tiny, weathered cabin. But another voice, a quieter, more curious one, whispered in her ear. What was it? Who was it? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, eerie quiet. She took one step, then another, her small bare feet moving silently over the mossy ground, drawn toward the scar in the landscape, toward the wreckage and the unknown. The scene was one of utter devastation, a violent intrusion of steel and fire into the tranquil heart of the forest. The helicopter was crumpled like a discarded can, its tail snapped off and lying 100 feet away, its once sleek body a mangled ruin of wires, glass, and twisted metal. A small fire licked at one of the rotor blades, hissing as it consumed the surrounding ferns. The smell was overwhelming, a toxic cocktail of fuel and scorched earth. Lily approached with a caution that belied her years, her eyes scanning the wreckage. She saw a briefcase, thrown clear, its leather hide split open to reveal neat stacks of paper, now scattered and fluttering in the slight breeze. She saw a single, immaculate leather shoe, its shine dully reflecting the dappled sunlight, and then she saw him. A man was slumped against the base of a massive oak tree, partially thrown from the cockpit. He was wearing a dark suit, now torn and dirtied, the fine fabric a stark contrast to the raw wilderness around him. One of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark gash on his forehead was slowly seeping blood, matting his short, dark brown hair. His face was pale under his light olive skin, a neatly trimmed stubble lining a sharp jaw now slack with unconsciousness. He looked like one of the men from the magazines her mother sometimes brought home from town, the kind with perfect teeth and watches that cost more than their cabin. He was beautiful and broken, a fallen king in a forgotten land. Lily stood frozen for a moment, a tiny, fair-haired sprite in a faded cotton dress, staring at the impossible sight. The silence was broken by a low groan from the man. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. They were the color of dark, rich coffee, but they held no recognition, only a deep, swimming confusion. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Is anyone there?" Lily didn't answer. She simply watched as he tried to push himself up, a sharp cry of agony escaping his lips as his body reminded him of its betrayal. He fell back against the tree, his head lolling to the side, his gaze finally finding her. He blinked, as if trying to clear a fog from his vision. Uh, a little girl? He murmured, his voice laced with disbelief. He looked around again at the smoking wreckage, at the silent, imposing trees, and then back at her, a tiny, solitary figure in the vast, indifferent wilderness. "Am I dead?" he asked, the question hanging in the air, a genuine, bewildered plea. "Are you an angel?" Lily finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "No," she said, shaking her head, her neat blonde hair catching the light. "You're in my woods." The man, whose name was Julian Croft, although he couldn't quite grasp that fact at the moment, tried to process her words. My woods. It sounded so proprietary, so simple. His world was a place of deeds, titles, and acquisitions, of billion-dollar contracts that carved up cities and continents. The idea that this vast, untamed wilderness could belong to a tiny child in a threadbare dress was so absurd it was almost comical. Yet as he lay there, a prisoner in his own shattered body, the authority in her soft voice felt more real than any stock certificate he had ever owned. Pain was a rising tide, a merciless fire that started in his leg and spread through every nerve, threatening to drown him. He tried to think, to access the part of his brain that was always in command, the part that solved impossible problems before breakfast. But it was like trying to tune a radio submerged in water. All he got was static and bursts of agony. He saw flashes of memory, the jarring lurch of the helicopter, the pilot's panicked face, the sickening vertigo of the fall, the world spinning into a green and brown blur. Then, nothing. Until her. "You need to help me," he gasped, the words catching in his throat. "There's a phone in my pocket." He fumbled at his suit jacket, his fingers clumsy and weak. Lily took a hesitant step closer. She had seen injured animals before. A bird with a broken wing, a fox caught in a hunter's forgotten trap. Her grandmother had taught her to be gentle, to be calm. She knelt beside him, her small face a mask of solemn concentration. She ignored his frantic gesturing toward his pocket and instead looked at the gash on his forehead. "You're bleeding," she stated, her voice matter of fact. Before he could protest or repeat his demand, she turned and darted back into the forest. For a terrifying moment, he thought she was abandoning him. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of pain. He was going to die here, alone, a feast for whatever creatures roamed these woods. He was Julian Croft. His face was on the cover of magazines. He commanded armies of lawyers and accountants. He couldn't die like this. It was undignified. It was God unacceptable. But a few moments later she returned. In her hands she held a clump of broad green leaves. She chewed them methodically, her cheeks puffing out until they were a pulpy mash. Julian watched, horrified and bewildered. "What are you doing?" he croaked. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression serious, and carefully applied the green poultice to the cut on his head. The mixture was cool and smelled of mint and damp earth. It stung for a second, then a soothing numbness began to spread across his brow. "Yarrow," she said, as if that explained everything. "It stops the bleeding. Grandma taught me." He stared at her, this strange little forest witch with her ancient remedies. His world was one of sterile clinics, of laser surgery and MRI machines. He had a personal physician on $1 million retainer, and here he was, being treated with chewed-up weeds by a 7-year-old. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. He let out a weak, breathy sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Lily watched him, her head tilted. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice soft with a genuine concern that cut through his layers of wealth and power, striking a place within him he hadn't known existed. He looked at her earnest face, at the dirt smudges on her cheek, at the profound seriousness in her eyes. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he told the simple, unvarnished truth. "Yes," he whispered. "Everything hurts." As the initial shock began to recede, it was replaced by a chilling awareness of his predicament. The pain in his leg was a constant, throbbing agony. Every attempt to shift his weight sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. He was utterly helpless, completely at the mercy of this child and the wilderness she called home. The sun was beginning its slow descent, its golden rays slanting through the canopy, painting long, ominous shadows on the forest floor. Soon it would be dark. Soon it would be cold. "My phone," he insisted, his voice gaining a hard edge of desperation. "Get my phone. I need to make a call." Lily looked at the pocket he indicated, then back at his face. She didn't move. There was no defiance in her stillness, only a calm, unwavering focus. "What's a phone?" she asked. The question was so genuine, so devoid of artifice that it stopped him cold. He stared at her as if she'd just asked him what the sun was. In his world, a phone was an extension of the self, a lifeline, a command center, the conduit through which billions of dollars and countless lives were managed. It was inconceivable that someone, even a child, wouldn't know what it was. "It's a box," he stammered, trying to find the words. "You talk into it. You can talk to anyone in the world." Lily's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of wonder in their blue depths. "Like magic?" she breathed. "Yes," Julian said, seizing the opportunity. "Exactly like magic. And I need you to get the magic box from my pocket so I can call for help." She considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "Grandma says there's no such thing as magic. Only what the earth gives you and what you do with your hands." She glanced at his leg, her gaze clinical and unafraid. The fabric of his expensive trousers was torn, revealing a gruesome bulge below the knee where the bone was clearly broken. "That's broken," she said simply. "I can't fix a break that bad, but I can make you a splint. You can't stay here. The night things will come out soon." Night things. The phrase sent a primal shiver down his spine. He was a man who lived in penthouses, who traveled in armored cars, who was protected by layers of security and technology. The idea of night things was something from a fairy tale. But here, with the shadows deepening and the forest groaning around them, it felt terrifyingly real. He watched, a helpless observer, as she went to work. With a focus that was almost unnerving in a child so young, she gathered straight, sturdy branches. From a pocket in her worn dress, she produced a small, sharp-edged piece of flint and a bit of twine. She stripped the smaller twigs from the branches with practiced ease. Then she approached his injured leg. "This will hurt," she warned, her voice gentle but firm. "You have to be very still. Don't scream. It brings the bad ones." He gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. "The bad ones?" he managed to ask. "Bears," she said, as casually as if she were saying squirrels, "and sometimes wolves, if they're hungry." He closed his eyes, a fresh wave of terror washing over him. He was a titan of industry, a master of the universe, and he was about to be eaten by a bear because a little girl in the woods didn't know what a telephone was. Lily worked with surprising strength and precision. She laid the branches on either side of his leg, from his ankle to his thigh. As she began to wrap the twine around them, pulling it tight, the broken ends of the bone grated against each other. An involuntary scream tore from his throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. Lily immediately clapped a small, firm hand over his mouth. "I told you not to scream," she hissed, her eyes wide and fearful, darting around the darkening woods. "Now you have to be quiet. Very, very quiet." He lay there, trembling, the echo of his own scream still ringing in his ears. The pain was a living thing, a ravenous beast chewing on his leg. But beneath the pain a new feeling was taking root. A strange, humbling sense of reliance. His entire life, his fortune, his power. None of it meant anything here. His survival depended entirely on the knowledge and courage of this tiny, mysterious girl. As she finished her work, tying the final knot on the makeshift splint, she looked down at him. The last vestiges of sunlight caught in her hair, creating a halo of gold around her head. "My name is Lily," she said softly. "You should have told me yours." He looked up into her clear, steady eyes, and for the first time since the crash, a piece of his old self surfaced. "Julian," he said. "My name is Julian." The darkness in the deep woods was unlike any Julian had ever experienced. It wasn't the gentle, twilight gray of the city, softened by the perpetual glow of streetlights and skyscrapers. This was a profound and absolute blackness, a thick, smothering blanket that swallowed light and sound. The air grew cold, carrying the damp, loamy scent of decaying leaves and rich earth. The forest, which had been a place of tranquil beauty in the daylight, transformed into a realm of unseen movements and unsettling noises. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Julian's system. He was acutely aware of his vulnerability, of his status as an intruder in a world that operated by its own ancient and unforgiving rules. He lay with his back against the rough bark of the oak, his splinted leg propped up on a pile of moss Lily had gathered for him. The pain had settled into a deep, relentless throb, a constant reminder of his brokenness. Lily sat beside him, a small, still presence in the vast darkness. She had refused to leave his side. "I can't leave you," she'd said, her logic unassailable. "You're hurt. The night things won't get you if I'm here." He wasn't sure how her tiny frame was supposed to deter a hungry bear, but her calm confidence was, strangely, the only thing keeping his terror at bay. She had built a small fire, using the flint from her pocket and a handful of dry tinder she'd collected. The flames crackled and danced, casting a small circle of warm, flickering light that held the oppressive darkness at arm's length. The fire was their island, their sanctuary. "Aren't you scared?" Julian asked, his voice a low whisper, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace. Lily looked at him, her face illuminated by the firelight. Her expression was serious. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Grandma says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what you have to do, even when your insides are all shaky." She hugged her knees to her chest. "I'm a little shaky right now. That was a big noise you made when you fell from the sky." "When you fell from the sky." It sounded like the beginning of a myth, a children's story. He felt a disconnect from his own life, as if the man in the tailored suit who ran a global empire was someone else entirely, a character in a book he'd once read. The man lying here in the dirt, dependent on a 7-year-old for his survival, felt much more real. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I didn't mean to scare you." She gave a small shrug. "It's okay. Are you hungry?" Before he could answer, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She carefully unfolded it to reveal a single, thick slice of dark bread and a small wedge of hard, pale cheese. It was clearly her own meal, perhaps her only meal for the day. "It's not much," she said, her voice tinged with apology. "But we can share." She broke the bread in half with a solemnity that suggested a sacred ritual, offering him the larger piece. Julian looked at the food in her small, outstretched hand. He was used to catered lunches, to Michelin-star restaurants, to private chefs who could procure any delicacy from anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. He had once spent over $10,000 on a single dinner, a fact that now filled him with a sudden, inexplicable shame. This simple offering of bread and cheese felt more valuable than any of it. His stomach rumbled, a raw, hollow ache. He hadn't eaten since a sterile, prepackaged breakfast on his private jet that morning. a lifetime ago. "Hm, no," he said, his voice thick. "You eat it. It's yours." Lily shook her head, her determination absolute. "Grandma says you always share what you have, especially with someone who's hurting. It makes the food taste better." She pushed the bread toward him again. "Eat. You need your strength." Hesitantly, he took it. The bread was dense and coarse, with a nutty, slightly sour flavor. The cheese was sharp and salty. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the nocturnal symphony of the forest. As he chewed the last of his bread, a profound sense of gratitude washed over him, so intense it was almost painful. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling he had forgotten he was capable of. He looked at the little girl beside him, this child who owned nothing but possessed a generosity of spirit that dwarfed his own immense fortune. She had tended his wound, splinted his leg, built him a fire, and shared her meager food, all without asking for anything in return. In the flickering firelight, with the immense dark forest pressing in around them, Julian Croft began to understand that he was the one who was truly poor. As the night wore on, a fragile truce formed between them, a bond forged in shared vulnerability and the elemental need for warmth and safety. The fire dwindled, and Lily would periodically add more sticks, her movements economical and precise. Julian found himself talking, the words spilling out of him, prompted by her simple, direct questions. She didn't ask about his work or his wealth. The concepts were too abstract. Instead, she asked about his home. "Is it a big cabin?" she asked, her chin resting on her knees. "Yes," he said, thinking of his sprawling penthouse apartment, a sterile glass and steel box suspended 50 stories above the city. "A very big cabin." He tried to describe it to her. The walls that were all windows, the view of the city lights stretching out like a carpet of fallen stars, the elevator that opened directly into his living room. Her eyes grew wide as she tried to imagine it. "You live in a glass box in the sky?" she asked, a touch of wonder and perhaps a little pity in her voice. "Don't you miss the trees?" He had never once missed the trees. He'd paid a fortune to be above them, to look down on the world, not to be in it. Now the thought of his silent, empty apartment felt cold and lonely. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a real conversation with someone that wasn't about a business deal or a strategic acquisition. He was surrounded by people, assistants, lawyers, board members, staff. But he was utterly alone. He asked her about her life, and she spoke of it with a simple, unadorned honesty. She told him about her grandmother, whose hands were gnarled from work, but whose touch was always gentle. She talked about her mother, who was sick. "Her chest hurts when she breathes," Lily explained, her voice dropping. "She coughs a lot. The doctor in town gave her some medicine, but it costs a lot of money, so we can only get it sometimes." The casual way she spoke of a life-or-death situation being dictated by a lack of money sent a spear of guilt through him. He thought of the loose change in the console of his car, probably more than the cost of her mother's medicine, forgotten and disregarded. "What do you do all day?" he asked, trying to picture a life so different from his own. "I help Grandma," she said. "We work in the garden. I look for herbs and mushrooms in the woods. Sometimes I read." She pointed to a small, worn book tucked into the waistband of her dress. "Grandma taught me my letters. It's my favorite. It's about a girl who travels to a magic land through a wardrobe. Her world was small, circumscribed by the forest and the needs of her family. But it was rich in ways he was only just beginning to comprehend. It was a world of practical skills, of folklore, of a deep connection to the earth. His was a world of theoretical value, of stock prices and market projections, a world that, from his current vantage point, felt hollow and meaningless. A wolf howled in the distance, a long, mournful cry that seemed to hang in the cold night air. Julian flinched, his body tensing. Lily, however, seemed unfazed. "They're just singing to the moon," she said calmly. "They won't bother us. The fire keeps them away." She looked at him, noticing his fear. "You're from the city, aren't you?" He nodded. "They don't have wolves in the city." "That's sad," she said, her sincerity absolute. "Everyone should have wolves to sing to them." As the hours passed, an exhausted drowsiness began to settle over him, the pain in his leg dulling to a persistent, manageable ache. He watched Lily, her small form silhouetted against the flames. She was starting to nod off, her head drooping forward before she would jerk it back up, determined to keep her vigil. "You should sleep," he said softly. "I'll watch the fire." She looked at him, her eyes heavy-lidded. "You're the one who's hurt. You need to sleep more." "We can't both stay awake all night," he reasoned. "You sleep for a while, and then you can wake me up and I'll take a turn." It was a negotiation, a partnership. It felt more significant than any boardroom deal he had ever closed. She finally acquiesced, curling up on a bed of dry leaves she had arranged near the fire, her worn book clutched to her chest like a teddy bear. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing soft and even. Julian was alone with his thoughts, the fire, and the vast, breathing darkness. He watched her sleep, a fierce, unfamiliar wave of protectiveness washing over him. This child, this near stranger, had saved his life. She had shown him more genuine kindness and compassion in the last few hours than he had experienced in the last 20 years. He thought about his own life, a relentless climb to the top, a path littered with broken relationships and ruthless decisions. He had everything a man could want. And yet, lying here in the dirt, he had never felt so empty. He looked up through the canopy at the sliver of moon and the pinpricks of stars visible between the leaves. He made a silent promise, not to any god he didn't believe in, but to the sleeping child beside him. If he got out of this, if he survived, things would be different. He would be different. For the first time, he had a reason. The first light of dawn was a subtle thing in the dense forest, not a brilliant explosion of color, but a slow, gentle dilution of the darkness. The impenetrable black softened to a deep indigo, then to a misty gray, gradually revealing the silhouettes of the trees. The air was cold and damp, and a thick mist clung to the ground, weaving through the ferns and around the tree trunks like a ghostly river. Julian woke with a start, the morning chill having seeped deep into his bones. His leg throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm, and every muscle in his body ached from the cold and the unnatural way he had been forced to sleep. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. The sterile, climate-controlled silence of his bedroom was replaced by the cacophony of the dawn chorus, 1,000 birds greeting the day with an exuberant, overlapping symphony of chirps, whistles, and calls. He pushed himself up, hissing in pain as his splinted leg protested. Lily was already awake, tending to the fire, which she had somehow kept alive through the night. She had a small, battered tin pot balanced on 2 stones at the edge of the flames, and a fragrant steam was rising from it. "Good morning," she said, her voice bright and cheerful, as if they were guests at a quaint country inn rather than survivors of a disaster. "I made tea." She poured a dark amber liquid into a cup, fashioned from a large, hollowed-out piece of bark. "It's pine needle tea. Grandma says it's full of morning sunshine." He accepted the makeshift cup, the warmth seeping into his frozen fingers. The tea was surprisingly good, with a fresh, resinous taste that seemed to wake him up from the inside out. It was better than the expensive imported green tea his assistant usually prepared for him. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He watched as she moved about their small campsite with a quiet efficiency. She checked the poultice on his head, replacing it with a fresh one. She examined the splint on his leg, tightening a piece of twine that had come loose. She was a natural caregiver, her small hands gentle but sure. There was a purposefulness to her actions that Julian, a man who commanded thousands, found himself envying. His purpose had always been tied to acquisition, to growth, to the abstract concept of shareholder value. Hers was simple and immediate, to care for the living things around her. "What happens now?" he asked, the question revealing the full extent of his helplessness. He had no plan, no strategy. He was off the grid, a ship without a rudder. "Now," she said, wiping her hands on her dress, "we go home. My cabin is not too far. Maybe 2 hours if we walk slow. Grandma will know what to do." The thought of walking for 2 hours on his shattered leg sent a fresh wave of despair through him. It was impossible. He couldn't even stand. "I can't walk," he said, the words a flat statement of defeat. Lily looked at him, not with pity, but with a thoughtful, appraising gaze, as if he were a puzzle to be solved. She disappeared into the woods and returned a few minutes later, dragging a long, thick, forked branch. "This will be your new leg for a while," she announced, propping it up in front of him. "You lean on me on one side, and you lean on the branch on the other. We can do it." Her confidence was absolute, leaving no room for argument. The process of getting him to his feet was a grueling, agonizing ordeal. Every movement sent shards of white-hot pain shooting up his leg. He bit his lip until it bled, determined not to scream again. Lily, for all her small size, was surprisingly strong, her shoulder fitting perfectly under his arm, providing a steady, reliable anchor. With her on one side and the crude crutch on the other, he finally managed to heave himself upright, balancing precariously on his good leg. He was drenched in sweat, trembling with exhaustion and pain, but he was standing. It felt like a monumental victory. "See?" she said, her voice slightly strained from his weight but still cheerful. "I told you." Their journey was a slow, torturous crawl. They moved one painful step at a time, a strange, symbiotic creature hobbling through the ancient forest. Julian's world shrank to the next few feet of ground in front of him, to the placement of his crutch, to the feeling of Lily's small, bony shoulder supporting him. He was forced to notice things he would have never seen from a helicopter or a luxury car. He saw the intricate patterns of moss on a fallen log, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves to dapple the ground in shifting patterns of light and shadow, the startling, vibrant red of a wild mushroom pushing its way through the dark soil. The forest was not just a green blur. It was a complex living entity, full of 1,000,000 tiny, interconnected lives. Lily kept up a steady stream of chatter, pointing things out to him. "That's a whisper pine," she said, indicating a tall, graceful tree. "If you listen close, it sounds like it's telling you secrets." "Those berries are poison," she warned, pointing to a cluster of waxy white berries. "But the birds can eat them. They have tougher tummies than we do." She was a living encyclopedia of the woods, her knowledge practical and deeply ingrained. She was as much a part of this ecosystem as the trees and the animals. Julian, the man who prided himself on knowing the intricacies of global markets, knew nothing here. He was the child, and she was the teacher. After what felt like an eternity, when Julian was sure he couldn't take another step, that he would simply collapse and let the forest reclaim him, the trees began to thin. Through a break in the foliage, he saw it, a small cabin nestled in a clearing. It was a humble, almost ramshackle structure, with walls made of rough-hewn logs and a roof of weathered wooden shingles, a curl of smoke rising lazily from a stone chimney. A small, well-tended garden grew beside it, bursting with vegetables and herbs. It was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. "We're here," Lily said, her voice filled with pride and relief. "We're home." As they stumbled into the clearing, the cabin door opened, and an old woman emerged. She was tall and wiry, with a cascade of long silver hair braided down her back. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line telling a story of hardship and resilience. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent. Lily's eyes, in an older face. She took in the scene before her granddaughter supporting a tall, bloodied stranger in a ruined suit. And her expression didn't flicker with surprise or fear. There was only a calm, assessing acceptance. "Lily," she said, her voice low and steady, "what have you brought home from the woods this time?" The woman, who introduced herself as Ilara, was Lily's grandmother. She moved with a quiet, powerful grace, her presence filling the small cabin. She assessed Julian's condition with a practiced eye, her touch surprisingly gentle as she examined his head wound and the crude splint. "The child did good work," she said, her gaze meeting Julian's. There was no deference in her eyes, no awe at his expensive, albeit ruined, suit. He was simply a wounded man, and she was a healer. The cabin was tiny, consisting of one main room that served as a kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters. A heavy wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a black kettle simmering over the low flames. In one corner, 2 simple cots were covered with patchwork quilts. Bunches of dried herbs and flowers hung from the rafters, filling the air with a complex, earthy aroma. The place was impeccably clean, and despite its obvious poverty, it radiated a sense of warmth and peace that Julian's sterile penthouse had always lacked. In another corner, on a larger bed, lay another woman. She was pale and thin, with Lily's blonde hair spread out on the pillow. Her breathing was shallow and punctuated by a faint, persistent wheezing. This was Lily's mother, Sarah. Her eyes were closed, but she stirred as they entered, a flicker of concern on her face. "Lily, is everything all right?" Her voice was a fragile whisper. "I'm fine, Mama," Lily said, rushing to her mother's side. "I found someone in the woods. He's hurt." Ilara helped Julian into one of the chairs at the table, a task that left him breathless and sweating. She gave him a cup of water from a bucket by the door, and he drank it greedily. It was cold and pure, tasting of minerals and earth. "The helicopter crashed just over the ridge," he explained, his voice hoarse. "Yesterday, around midday." Ilara nodded slowly, as if a helicopter falling from the sky was a perfectly ordinary occurrence. "We heard the thunder," she said. "We thought it was a storm coming." She cut away his torn trousers with a sharp knife, exposing the swollen, discolored flesh around the break. The sight of it made his stomach churn. "This is a bad one," she said, her voice calm. "The bone needs to be set. It's going to hurt more than anything you've ever felt before." She looked him directly in the eye. "But it has to be done. If it heals crooked, you'll never walk right again. Do you understand?" He nodded, his throat tight. He understood. He was in their world now, and their rules, the rules of nature and necessity, were the only ones that mattered. While Ilara gathered supplies, clean rags, more twine, and 2 smooth, flat pieces of wood, Lily brought him a bowl of warm stew. It was a simple vegetable stew, made from the produce of their garden, but it was thick and nourishing. As he ate, he was acutely aware of the quiet, wheezing breaths coming from the corner bed. He looked at Sarah, at her translucent skin and the dark circles under her eyes. She was so young, probably not even 30, yet she looked frail and worn out by illness. He thought of the world-class medical facilities he had at his disposal, the teams of specialists he could summon with a single call. Here, they had pine needle tea and a hope that was as fragile as a bird's egg. The shame he'd felt in the forest returned, sharper and more painful than before. After he finished the stew, Ilara returned to the table. "All right, Mr. City Man," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "It's time." She handed him a thick piece of leather. "Bite down on this, and try not to break my table when you scream." Lily came and stood beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. "It's okay to be shaky," she whispered, her voice a tiny anchor in his sea of fear. "Just remember to breathe." Ilara and another woman he hadn't noticed before, a neighbor from a nearby homestead named Martha, who had been summoned by a signal of smoke from the chimney, positioned themselves on either side of his leg. He put the leather between his teeth, the taste of it old and worn. He looked at Lily, at her wide, compassionate eyes, and then at Ilara, whose face was set in a mask of intense concentration. "On three," Ilara said. "1, 2. She didn't wait for 3. With a sudden, coordinated movement, she and Martha pulled. The world exploded. It was a universe of pure, white-hot agony, a pain so absolute and all-consuming that it obliterated thought, time, and space. A sound was ripped from his throat, a muffled, guttural roar of animal suffering, even through the leather. His vision went black, and as he felt the splintered ends of the bone grind and then slot back into place with a sickening pop, he mercifully lost consciousness. He woke up slowly, drifting back to awareness on a sluggish tide. The first thing he registered was the absence of that sharp, specific agony. The pain was still there, a deep, pervasive throbbing, but the searing, serrated edge was gone. He was lying on one of the cots, his leg now encased in a much sturdier, more expertly crafted splint, propped up on a stack of folded blankets. The late afternoon sun streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room was quiet save for the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft rhythmic sound of Sarah's breathing, which seemed, to his ears, a little less strained than before. Ilara was sitting at the table, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. She looked up as he stirred. "So the sleeping giant awakes," she said, a hint of wry amusement in her voice. "How's the leg?" "Better," he croaked, his throat raw. "Thank you." He felt a profound, humbling gratitude that left him speechless. These people who had nothing had taken him in, tended to his grievous injury, and asked for nothing. They had shared their home, their food, and their skill, simply because he was a person in need. He had spent his life operating on the principle of quid pro quo, of transactions and leverage. This pure, unadorned altruism was a foreign language he was only just beginning to learn. He lay there for a long time, watching the quiet domestic rhythm of the cabin. He watched Ilara prepare a poultice, her hands moving with an ancient, practiced wisdom. He watched Lily as she sat by her mother's bed, reading aloud from her book about the magic wardrobe, her soft voice a gentle murmur in the still air. Sarah seemed to be sleeping more peacefully, a faint touch of color returning to her cheeks. Julian realized he was witnessing a form of wealth he had never known existed. It wasn't measured in stock portfolios or real estate holdings. It was measured in love, in resilience, in the unbreakable bonds of family and community. This tiny cabin held more true value than all his skyscrapers combined. As evening fell, Ilara brought him another bowl of stew and a cup of a different, bitter-tasting tea. "Willow bark," she explained, "for the pain and the fever." It worked better than any pharmaceutical painkiller he'd ever taken, easing the ache in his leg and clarifying his thoughts. The fog of pain and disorientation that had clouded his mind since the crash was finally beginning to lift. With clarity came a crushing sense of urgency. He had been missing for over 24 hours. His company, his staff, his entire world would be in chaos. A search party would be looking for him. His disappearance would be front-page news. He had to contact them. He had to let them know he was alive. "Ilara," he began, trying to sit up. "I need to get a message out. There are people looking for me. A lot of people. My company. It's a very big company. They'll be worried." Ilara finished grinding her herbs before she answered, her movements unhurried. "The nearest town with a telephone is a day's walk from here. Maybe half a day, if you have a horse and know the paths. You are in no condition to go anywhere." "But you don't understand," he insisted, a note of his old, authoritative tone creeping back into his voice. "There will be a reward. A huge reward. More money than you can possibly imagine. For helping me. For getting a message to the sheriff in town." Ilara stopped her work and looked at him, her dark eyes sharp and penetrating. Her gaze made him feel like a spoiled child. "Mr. Croft," she said, and the use of his name, a name he hadn't told her, startled him. "We are not fools. We know who you are. Lily's mother used to clean rooms at the fancy lodge on the other side of the mountain, the one you fly your helicopter to for your weekend escapes. She saw your picture in a magazine the guests left behind." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. They knew. They had known all along who he was, what he was worth. And yet, they had treated him not as a winning lottery ticket, but as a human being. The fact that they hadn't immediately tried to capitalize on his identity was, in his world, unthinkable. "We don't want your money," Ilara continued, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through his astonishment. "We did for you what we would do for any soul in need. That is the way of people who live far from the cities. We are each other's insurance policy. Today we help you. Tomorrow, we may need help ourselves." She paused, her gaze softening slightly as she glanced toward her sleeping daughter. "However," she said, "my daughter is sick. The town doctor says she needs a specialist, someone in the city. He says there are treatments, but they are for men like you, not for us." The unspoken plea hung in the air, more powerful than any demand. She wasn't asking for a reward. She was asking for a life. She was presenting him with a moral equation that was both simple and profound. Julian looked from Ilara's proud, weary face to Sarah's fragile form, and then to Lily, who was watching him with an expression of unwavering trust. They had saved his life. They had shown him a kindness he didn't deserve. And now he had the power to save one of theirs. It wasn't a transaction. It was a debt of honor. "When they find me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "your daughter will have the best doctors in the world. I promise you that." Ilara held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face. Then she gave a single, slow nod. It was an acceptance, not of his wealth, but of his word. In that moment, a new kind of contract was forged in the heart of the wilderness, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with grace. The next 2 days passed in a slow, strange rhythm that was completely alien to Julian. His life had always been a frantic, meticulously scheduled race against the clock, a series of back-to-back meetings, conference calls, and international flights. Time was a commodity to be managed, optimized, and conquered. Here in the cabin, time was measured by the movement of the sun across the floor, the crackling of the fire, and the steady, quiet pattern of Sarah's breathing. Stripped of his phone, his laptop, and his entourage, Julian was forced into a state of idleness he hadn't experienced since he was a child. At first it was maddening. He felt a phantom itch for his devices, a compulsive urge to check emails, to monitor the markets, to do something. He was a man defined by his actions, by his relentless productivity. To be still felt like a form of death. But gradually, as the hours and days melted into one another, he began to change. He started to listen. He listened to Ilara's stories of the forest, of the changing seasons, of the old ways of her people. He learned about the medicinal properties of the plants in her garden, about how to read the sky for weather, about how to live in harmony with the natural world instead of in opposition to it. He listened to Lily read from her book, getting lost in the tale of Narnia, a world as magical and strange as the one he now found himself in. He discovered she was bright and inquisitive, her mind a sponge for stories and information. She would ask him questions about the city, her eyes wide with curiosity. Is it true that the buildings are so tall they poke holes in the clouds? Is it true that you can get any kind of food you want, even strawberries in the middle of winter? He answered her questions as best he could, but found his descriptions of his world sounding hollow and strange, even to his own ears. How could he explain the soulless convenience of a supermarket to a child who knew the name of every plant in her garden and had helped to grow the food on her plate? His most important conversations were with Sarah. She was awake more often now, buoyed by Alara's herbal remedies, and perhaps by the new current of hope that flowed through the small cabin. Her voice was weak, but her mind was sharp. She was shy at first, intimidated by his reputation, but his brokenness and vulnerability made him approachable. She asked him about his life, not with the fawning curiosity he was used to, but with a genuine interest in the man behind the myth. He found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken of in years, things he had buried deep beneath the foundations of his empire. He told her about his childhood, about growing up poor in a rough neighborhood, about the relentless hunger for success that had driven him, the fear of ending up like his father, a good man broken by a lifetime of hard labor and bad luck. I just wanted to be safe, he confessed, the admission startling him with its raw honesty. I thought if I had enough money, nothing could ever hurt me again. He looked down at his shattered leg. I was wrong. Sarah listened patiently, her eyes full of a deep, sad wisdom. Being safe isn't about having high walls, she said, her voice a soft whisper. It's about having people who will catch you when you fall. Julian looked around the small cabin at the 3 generations of women who had caught him. He had built an empire of walls, and they had built a fortress of love. On the 3rd morning, the sound came. It started as a faint, distant hum, almost imperceptible beneath the sounds of the forest. But it grew steadily, a familiar, mechanical chopping sound that was anathema to the natural world. A helicopter. Lily ran outside, her face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Julian felt a strange pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Relief, yes, but also regret. His rescue was at hand. His exile was over. He would be returned to his world of power and privilege. But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that he would be leaving something vital behind in this small, humble cabin. The helicopter, a sleek black machine belonging to his corporate security team, landed in the clearing, its rotors kicking up a storm of leaves and dust. 2 men in dark tactical gear jumped out, their movements sharp and efficient. They were followed by a man in a crisp suit, his face etched with worry, his chief of staff. Marcus. Marcus rushed toward the cabin, his expensive shoes sinking into the soft earth. He stopped short in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. His boss, the formidable Julian Croft, lying on a crude cot, his leg in a primitive splint, being tended to by a little girl and an old woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a history book. Mr. Croft. Sir, Marcus stammered, his composure rattled. We've been searching everywhere. We feared the worst. I'm alive, Marcus, Julian said, his voice calm and steady. Thanks to these people. He looked at Alara, then at Lily. They saved my life. The transition back to his world was swift and jarring. A medical team swarmed him, checking his vital signs, administering a morphine drip that clouded his mind, and carefully transferring him onto a stretcher. He was lifted into the helicopter, the familiar, sterile smell of it a stark contrast to the earthy scent of the cabin. Before they took off, he called Marcus over. "These people are coming with us," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The woman on the bed, Sarah, needs immediate medical attention. Her mother and daughter are not to leave her side. Is that understood?" Marcus blinked, confused, but he knew better than to question a direct order. "Yes, sir, of course." Julian looked out the window as the helicopter lifted off the ground. He saw the cabin shrink below, a tiny outpost of humanity in a vast green sea. He saw Ilara and Lily standing in the clearing, watching them go. Lily raised a small hand and waved. Julian raised his own in return, a silent promise passing between the man in the sky and the girl on the ground. The world he was returning to had not changed. But he had. And he was about to turn that world upside down. The hospital was the epitome of modern medicine, a gleaming white sanctuary of technology and expertise. Julian was given a private wing, a suite of rooms that looked more like a five-star hotel than a medical facility. A team of the country's top orthopedic surgeons was assembled, and they operated on his leg, skillfully piecing the shattered bone back together with titanium pins and plates. He was told he would make a full recovery, though it would take months of physical therapy. But Julian's focus was not on himself. A few floors below, in the best room in the cardiac and pulmonary care unit, Sarah was undergoing a battery of tests. Julian had been explicit. Spare no expense. He had brought in specialists from around the globe, consultants whose time was usually booked years in advance. Ilara and Lily were installed in an adjacent suite, bewildered by the opulence and the relentless hum of the city. They had never seen a television before, never slept in a bed so soft, never seen so much food go to waste. Lily was fascinated by the elevators and the automatic doors, but she was also scared. The city was a roaring, concrete monster, and she missed the quiet whisper of the pines. She spent most of her time by her mother's side, holding her hand, reading to her from her worn book, a small, unchanging anchor in a world that had been turned upside down. The diagnosis for Sarah came back quickly. She had a severe, chronic form of asthma, exacerbated by a lung infection that had been left untreated for too long. It was serious, life-threatening if it continued to be neglected, but it was treatable. With the right medication, inhalers, and respiratory therapy, she could live a normal, healthy life. The cost of this treatment for a lifetime was astronomical. To Julian, it was a rounding error. When the head specialist, a world-renowned doctor with a hushed, reverent bedside manner, presented Julian with the treatment plan and the projected costs, Julian simply nodded. "Do it," he said, "and send me the bill." The doctor, accustomed to dealing with insurance companies and hospital budgets, was momentarily stunned into silence. Julian, meanwhile, was undergoing a different kind of recovery. His leg was healing, but his mind and soul were being rebuilt. The days of forced inactivity gave him something he hadn't had in decades: time to think. He had his assistant bring him files, not market analyses or acquisition reports, but a comprehensive overview of his own charitable giving. It was a long list of large tax-deductible donations to prestigious museums, opera houses, and universities, the kind of philanthropy that got your name engraved on a plaque in a lobby. It was all about image, about legacy. It was hollow. It meant nothing. He thought about Ilara's words. "We are each other's insurance policy." He thought about Lily sharing her last piece of bread. That was real. That was meaningful. He called Marcus into his room. "Liquidate 10% of my personal holdings in Croft Industries," he ordered. Marcus's jaw dropped. "Sir, that's billions of dollars. The market will panic. The board will go insane. It will be seen as a catastrophic loss of confidence. I don't care, Julian said, his voice calm but unyielding. I have a new venture I'm investing in, and I want you to cancel the gala for the museum extension, all of it. Reroute the entire budget to a new project. A new project, sir? Marcus asked, scrambling to take notes, his mind racing to catch up with his boss's radical new direction. Yes, Julian said, a slow smile spreading across his face. We're going to call it the Lilly Foundation, and it's not going to put our name on buildings. It's going to put medicine in cabins, books in schools, and food on tables. It's going to invest in people, not plaques. Over the next few weeks, as he and Sarah recovered in their separate wings of the hospital, the world began to feel the aftershocks of Julian Croft's transformation. The financial news channels went into a frenzy over his massive stock sale. The society pages were aghast at the cancellation of the season's biggest charity ball. Rumors flew. He was dying. He was having a breakdown. He was being blackmailed. No one could comprehend the simple truth. He had woken up. Julian ignored the noise. He spent his time with Lily and Alara. He took them to the hospital rooftop garden, a small patch of green amidst the concrete canyons of the city. He watched as Lily touched the petals of a cultivated rose, her expression one of wonder. "It's beautiful," she said, "but it doesn't smell as nice as the wild ones in the woods." Alara looked out at the sprawling city below, a landscape of endless steel and glass. "So many people," she murmured, "all living on top of each other. But do they know their neighbors? Do they help each other when they fall?" Julian didn't have an answer, but he knew he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to make one. The day Sarah was discharged from the hospital was a milestone. She walked out on her own, her breathing easy and clear for the first time in years. The color had returned to her face, and her eyes, once clouded with pain, were bright with hope. Julian, now walking with the aid of a single, elegant cane, was there to meet them. He had arranged for a car, but it wasn't a limousine. It was a comfortable, unassuming SUV. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice nervous. "Home," Julian said with a smile. But he didn't take them to the airport. Instead, he drove them to a quiet, tree-lined street in a pleasant suburban neighborhood, a place with good schools, parks, and a sense of community. He pulled up in front of a beautiful, modest house with a wraparound porch and a large garden in the back. "What is this?" Alara asked, looking at the house with suspicion. "This is your new home," Julian explained. "If you want it, it's close to Sarah's doctor's, and there's a wonderful school just down the street for Lily." He handed Alara a set of keys and a deed. "It's yours. No strings attached." Alara looked at the keys in her hand, then at him. "We cannot accept this," she said, her pride a fierce, protective shield. "We did not save you for a house." "I know that," Julian said gently. "You saved me for nothing, and in doing so, you gave me everything. This isn't a payment. It's a gift. It's what neighbors do for each other. Please, let me do this, for my own sake as much as yours." He saw Lily peeking through the car window at a large oak tree in the front yard, a perfect tree for a swing. He saw the look on Sarah's face, a look of overwhelming relief, the lifting of a burden she had carried her entire life. After a long moment, Alara closed her hand around the keys. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "The garden is very nice," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It has good sun." It was her way of saying thank you. It was her way of saying yes. In the months that followed, Julian dedicated himself to two things: his physical therapy and the establishment of the Lilly Foundation. He was relentless in both. He pushed his body to heal, to walk without a cane, to erase the last physical traces of the crash. At the same time, He poured his fortune and his formidable business acumen into his new foundation. The Lilly Foundation operated on a simple, radical principle. Find the people who have fallen through the cracks and help them. It established mobile medical clinics that brought city doctors to remote rural communities. It created scholarships for underprivileged children. It funded food banks, homeless shelters, and job training programs. Julian was not a distant benefactor. He was hands-on, visiting the clinics, meeting the scholarship students, listening to the stories of the people his foundation was helping. He discovered a sense of fulfillment that his corporate conquests had never provided. But his true north, his anchor, remained the family he had found in the woods. He was a regular visitor at their new home. He would sit on the porch with Ilara for hours, listening to her wisdom. He would talk with Sarah, who was growing stronger and more confident every day, even taking classes at the local community college. Most importantly, he spent time with Lily. He helped her with her homework. He pushed her on the swing he had hung from the old oak tree. He took her to museums and libraries, opening up the world for her, just as she had opened it for him. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the crash, Julian took Lily for a walk in a large state park not far from her home. The leaves were turning, painting the forest in brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. As they walked along a path crunching leaves under their feet, Lily was quiet. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked. "I was just thinking," she said, her small hand slipping into his, "that I'm glad you fell from the sky that day." Julian stopped and looked down at her bright, innocent face, so full of love and trust. His eyes stung with tears. He had lost everything in that crash: his helicopter, his health, his sense of invincibility. But in losing it all, he had found the one thing he had been searching for his entire life without even knowing it: a reason. A home. A family. "Huh. Me too, Lily," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Me too." He squeezed her hand, and together they continued walking. A billionaire who had learned the meaning of wealth, and a little girl from the woods who had been rich all along. Their steps perfectly in sync. Two souls who had saved each other, moving forward into the light.